Well, good morning, folks. We're going to have a journey episode here with Bill Conrad, and we're going to be talking about his great book, The Great Pretense, a tour through the boneyard of CIA war for drugs. Yes, I've got my copy too. The interesting thing is, I started off on this journey from my daddy, and he told me about this drug running. I didn't understand it, and even being a hippie and having some understanding about drugs and the drug trade, it still took me many years to get my head around the fact that our intelligence agencies were bringing in tons of narcotics. Okay, and because the reason I often ask is why? Okay, is it some sort of intelligence, gambit? Okay, to I'd read all these books and we would I would find some general, he would pop up and he would say, well, if we're going to be the big butt on the bench, we ought to be the big butt on the bench. And so that was their rationale for being involved with the drug trade is um, that if they were involved in it, then they could have a handle on it. Okay. But when you look at it, in intelligence, one thing you find in intelligence is who's at the other end of a drug trade has a little fiefdom because they do. They get intelligence and then they also get extra money that they don't have to go ask, the Congress for. So it gives them things to do. And it's been my contention too that there are forces above the intelligence agencies that wanted to keep some plants illegal because then you can sell those plants for more than gold, which gives you a big pile of money to go out and corrupt things. And that's very quite, um, you know, in our face, okay, that the drug money uh, leads us to a lot of corruption that has been happening in our political situation. It's my posit too that the quote unquote drugs, okay, these three plants should just be legal, okay, because we had prohibition here under with alcohol, and the guy behind the counter didn't care how old the people were. He just cared if they could put a nickel up on the counter. And by the time prohibition ended, we had 11 and 12-year-old alcoholics, okay, because there was absolutely no control over it. And so again, I think they should be legal. But beyond all that, Bill Conroy has spent, Lord have mercy, decades, okay, looking into um, this, I don't know if you want to call it a process or what, of the intelligence agencies using their secrecy, okay, to bring in narcotics. And it's just insidious. Okay. So, and we've got Todd Bauman here too, gives a little bit of a different look. I generally have come things from well, you might say a more liberal position. Todd's been a little bit more conservative in his life. And then we have the author, Bill Conroy. So, Bill, what are your thoughts about what I said in the introduction here?
The only thought I have is what I've been able to kind of prove, and it's clear that
You're a journalist.
right. So I like motives are always the hardest thing to nail down. Facts are a lot easier, and the facts are how you interpret them can be different. But the facts are, yeah, the CIA over the years has been very involved in the narco trafficking world. What I've seen what I've seen is always as part of ops, and the people I've talked to, and like you said, during Iran Contra, when the CIA was involved in facilitating drug trafficking for the Contras, so they could raise money to buy arms, and they were also flying drugs back and guns back and forth to facilitate that particular insurgency. That was all in the name of, the White House and geopolitical politics. And the CIA regularly has assets that are part of the narco-trafficking world. Back in Panama, for example, Manuel Noriega was a longtime CIA asset, paid a lot of money. That's even in the court record. It's just that he started doing, running more drugs than they were comfortable with. He was going outside their frame a little bit. And so they thought he was becoming too dangerous, and they took him down. So I think it's hard to separate. All of it involves drug running, but there's the part that's mission centered, like we want to destabilize this government, so we can do that because we know that the criminals are part of the government. So we cultivate them as assets, and then we let them keep doing business. And then we get the intelligence and also, the means to manipulate that government, maybe even get that guy in power. Right now, they pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was the former president of Honduras, who was convicted and sentenced to 45 years for trafficking hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States. He was pardoned by the president, Trump, and now they're trying to get him back into power in Honduras because they can control him. So yeah, we regularly work with narco traffickers, and the CIA is the kind of the covert arm of our government that facilitates that. Now, within that world where you have all this drug money being used for geopolitical purposes or to penetrate governments, you naturally have tons of money that's not accounted for flowing around it. And that's where the corruption comes in. That's where you get guys in the CIA who think, hell, I can make a little extra money here. They're not paying me very well at the CIA. I'm just going to dip my hand in this pool. No one's going to know. So you just automatically set up a corrupt system when you operate corruptly. So when you work with criminals, you're going to have criminal activity. So that's kind of how I see it. And over the years, every decade you can find an example of where CIA covert missions, and they only show up when they screw up. When these covert missions get blown, like we just saw in Mexico, in Chihuahua, where two CIA agents wearing state police uniforms were killed in a alleged car crash after they were on the ground, unilaterally without Mexican government permission, carrying out some kind of covert mission, which was probably targeting one of the cartels that is friendly to the Sheinbaum government, in the sense that the government, all the political systems in Mexico are infiltrated with cartel payoffs and bribes and activity. But so you've got three major parties there, right? Moreno, PRI, and PAN. And Marino, they all have this problem. Doesn't mean everyone in the government's correct, but it's corrupt. But that's how we deal with putting pressure on the government. So we work with PAN, which is very opposed to Sheinbaum and Marina. PAN is very in league and has been over the years in Chihuahua with the Juarez cartel, which is a bitter opponent of the Sinaloa cartel. So we start indicting all these politicians in Marino, which is Scheinbaum's party, trying to make it look like she's corrupt when we're working with a corrupt governor in facilitating, some kind of CIA mission there, and the operation got blown, and so now we know about it. And then we had the CNN report saying, "Oh yeah, we have this unit of CIA that's out doing targeted assassinations in Mexico," and I wrote my story about Mexico being targeted by a CIA op like two or 3 days before CNN came out with confirmation of that. And then we have the Chihuahua thing, and another author for you, I've used as one of my sources for years, who has connections still inside our intelligence agencies in the military, comes back and says, yeah, the Mexican Marines did the forensics on that car crash, and it was actually a bomb. It was probably a cartel bomb. We don't know if even the cartel knew they were CIA, if that's the case, because they were wearing state police uniforms for Mexico. So they may have been, and there have been a number of hits in those mountains in Chihuahua because there's a cartel war going on. You could tell that by looking at Juarez. The murder numbers in the last 3 months are going through the ceiling. That means there's a cartel war. And it's probably between the Sinaloa and the Juarez cartel, which is now run by La Línea, La Línea was started by former and current Mexican cops. When I covered the House of Death case, it was Mexican cops who were the executioners. They go out and investigate the murders they just committed. So this is the world you're dealing.
Bill,
Um,
you had I've heard you say that traditionally conventional wisdom is you take out the head of a snake if it's a corrupt system. But in this particular case, in that culture down there, you take out the head of the snake, you create a whole bunch of hydras that make it even worse. I've heard you say that. Now, couple that with the fact that we are now learning that the CIA is actively operating inside Mexico, the tensions that result from that between the countries. If you could describe what you were talking about removing the head of the snake in that type of situation, and then on top of it, the tensions that result between the two countries when this stuff is discovered and revealed.
Yeah, on the first question, yeah, the way the two like DEA loves to put all these charts on the walls and who all the kingpins are, but they don't really understand. And I had a DEA guy, head of the El Paso Intelligence Center, was telling me so. And Chuck Bowden, who was a writer, he's saying you can have all these cameras and all this surveillance. And at the time, Chuck was writing a book about it, the DEA head of El Paso Intelligence Center, whose brother was the victim of a cartel hit. They came across the border, hit him. He says, you can have all this stuff up there, but you can't see a 13-year-old with a gun crossing the border. Committing murder. In other words, you're not what we think we know about the cartels, in at least from the law enforcement perspective. What I saw is they want to put a corporate kind of veneer over it, and if we take out the CEO, it's going to complete, just like in Iran. If we take out the leadership, the whole government's going to fall apart. Well, they're wrong. They're just dead wrong, because the way the cartel system works is it's embedded, it's down to the community level. And there is no, the only reason someone rises to the top to run a distribution network like El Chapo is because they happen to be the most ruthless apex predator in the group. As soon as they're gone, there's another ruthless apex predator ready to step in to run that part of the operation. These guys figure, I'd rather have 5 years of a glorious life than, a lifetime of poverty and despair. They're willing to die for this stuff. And so you're not going to stop it by taking out, a kingpin, because there's right under them, there's 10 other kingpins ready to step up, and they're going to shoot it out and see, what you end up with, like we're seeing, is more violence and cartel wars. And around the cartel wars are a lot of innocent victims, right? And so this is an insane strategy that seems more bent on perpetuating the drug war, justifying these huge budgets for the military and for law enforcement and the militarization of our streets, all in the name of let's get the next kingpin and it'll all stop. No, it's actually perpetuates this drug war. And then the other thing with Mexico, because we invaded Mexico, I know it was a long time ago, back in the 1800s, actually, Polk's War was, I got to look the years up, but it was right in that time period. And we took basically Arizona, California, and New Mexico from Mexico. And and it actually goes back to the Texas independent fight when Santa Anna was defeated in Houston, and the Alamo comes out of that. But within Mexico, it's a third rail. Any hint that U.S. government is sending troops or any kind of operatives like CIA into the country, without the cooperation of the Mexican, approval of the Mexican government, is like threatening to end Social Security here. I mean, it creates this huge partisan rift, and that's what's going on in Mexico right now, and it's very predictable. So the partisan, over this issue, the CIA, they're calling the people, part of the country is calling the people in PAN and the governor of PAN a traitor for working with the U.S. And concealing it from the Mexican president. Other people are saying, Moreno, the president's party, is the narco party, and this is proof they got to go, And so it's just, and everyone is like upset by the fact that we have, or at least in Mexico, there's a lot of there are people in the streets over this. The fact that a CIA op was exposed, and what's it up to? Are they trying to destabilize our elections, destabilize our country? Just put the shoe on the other foot. Let's say this was a Russian operation that was exposed in the United States. I mean, how would we react? I mean, I bet you there'd be some people, saying, great, that, Russia, they're working for Trump, or let's say they're working for Trump. It's helping Trump. That we kind of saw that. And then they excuse it. And the other part of the country is all up in arms over it, saying this is blatant, election interference by a foreign government.
So does does the CIA in Mexico, are they putting their thumb on one side or the other? Or are they just sitting back and watching it and seeing who's going to win? Or, what do you think about that?
Well, they definitely, it depends because the CIA is a tool of the White House. So it changes, right? But under Trump, it is clear that this is a operation throughout Latin America. They're working on it in all the countries that have left-leaning governments: Brazil, Mexico, Colombia. Honduras is a little different situation. They just want to perpetuate the ruling government there by getting this narco in eventually. But they're targeting Cuba right now. They're targeting all the left-leaning governments that are left in Latin America. And they want, a puppet in there, essentially. They're not necessarily a puppet. They want a government in there that's friendly to U.S. interests. And that right now means allowing us to go in there and exploit the oil and the rare minerals that exist in Mexico with impunity, essentially. Just give us sweetheart deals and let us go in and drill, baby, drill, or dig, baby, dig. And that's a big issue in Mexico. There's a lot of people organized against a lot of these extractive mining companies that just come in, just destroy the environments, destroy the communities that have been there hundreds of years because they poison the water and all that. And they do that. That's the way it works. We've seen that we saw that for years in Latin America already, with the Chiquita banana operations when we want to be in control, and we want to make sure our businesses and investments down there aren't nationalized or taxed or threatened in any way. So yeah, clearly we want a government change. We want Scheinbaum out. And we're doing, that's what this CIA op is about, is creating some chaos in Mexico that makes it hard for her to govern, makes it less likely that she's going to be effective or get Moreno, her candidates, in at all the other levels that they need. Because a lot of these are state governors, and if you've got a friendly governor, you can go in and drill.
Yeah.
Right. So that's always been the game down there. And we've always supported historically very right wing to authoritarian to brutal dictators, not because we're necessarily in favor of brutal dictators. I'm sure if the left leaning governments there were like very open to all this stuff that we want to do, they would be fine. They just want to, it's money. It's corporate money and corporate influence and if we were really after the drug war, all the banks, including U.S. banks, have all been indicted at one, not to, have been charged with money laundering, but none of them, there has not been a bank CEO that's gone to jail. There has not been a bank that, other than Wachovia, which was bankrupt because of what it did, that is put out of business. But they get a slap on the wrist and it's business as usual because we want the money to keep flowing. We're not worried about the money. We're not worried about the guns. We're not worried about all the murders in Mexico. That's fine. Keep them down there. We want the money, and all that drug money goes south. We want to make sure we got our hands on as much of the money and as much of the natural resources as we can to, make Wall Street happy. And that's just the game. And it's not moral. It's repugnant. But, for most
Real
Americans,
politic.
it's transparent. They don't know. They don't see that because it is secret.
What about fentanyl? Because heroin was coming from the opium poppy, which was a plant. Okay. But it seems a lot that fentanyl is replacing that to a certain extent. How is that working as far as the narcotics trafficking?
Well, fentanyl is a funny one because it's the one everyone focuses on. It's an incredibly dangerous drug, and I see the effects of it in Seattle here all the time. Either both from addiction standpoint, but also just overdose, right? But most of the fentanyl is, right now meth is a bigger thing, but we make meth here too. But most of the fentanyl couldn't be made without precursor chemicals from China. And so it's just, it's batched in Mexico, and most of the people actually transporting it are, because it's pills. It's a lot of them are U.S. citizens coming back across the border, or they're mules that they run across the border. So it's also, one of the drugs that I think the cartels probably found a very high profit margin on, and probably don't care. They're. I'm not trying to defend the cartels here. I mean, they're about money too, and they don't care who dies as long as they make their money. And so fentanyl, I think, is just one of those drugs that because of, frankly, without China's help, it would not have taken off like it did. But they just made it very easy to make the drug and get it up to the states. Heroin has always been around. It'll make a comeback. Fentanyl, I mean, these drugs kind of ebb and flow in terms of, which ones are more prevalent in the country. Cocaine's making a comeback now, even though we're supposedly blowing up cocaine drug boats. There's more cocaine out there than ever. So to a particular, and then there's all the synthetic drugs that are out there that frankly can be as dangerous, some of them, as fentanyl, that are outside our legal framework because they're brand new and we haven't made them illegal. So the drug addiction, my view on this is whether it came from Mexico or it comes from Canada or it comes on a boat from Asia, we are going to have drugs in this country. It's almost impossible to stop them. And I think I agree with you. There are a bunch of drugs we could legalize and cut the cartel stranglehold, the organized crime stranglehold on these drugs, like during Prohibition. Cannabis is clearly one of them. We still only have half the states that have made it legal in some way, medical or recreational. That means there's still a black market for marijuana in half the country, which feeds cartels. So why we don't have it national, deschedule that is beyond me. There's other drugs we'd have to think long and hard about legalizing. You legalize highly addictive drugs. There's people that 10 people may do it. There's going to be one that ends up a lifetime addict out of it. That's just the way those drugs are. So we got to think about how do we handle those drugs? Why are we not working on the demand side here and trying to, be a lot more proactive in preventing people from getting addicted to these drugs to begin with, or once they are having, real addiction treatment that works.
You just hit on something, Bill. What you're describing is a culture that accepts this and facilitates drug use and drug abuse. There's that issue. How do you change that culture? And then a more practical situation seemingly would be border enforcement. Why isn't border enforcement an option?
Well, first on border enforcement, I love it every time they say the border is completely shut down. No one's getting through. Well, what's getting through is all the commerce, and that's where the drugs are. They're embedded and hidden in commerce to various shell companies, trucks, any number. There's that, at least across the international bridges. That's the game. So stopping the people isn't going to stop the drugs, right? You'd have to actually hermetically seal our entire border and all our airspace to stop this stuff, and that's never going to happen. So on the other part about the culture, I mean, you see me grabbing this. This is a vape. I've been fighting cigarette addiction on and off, nicotine addiction my whole life, right? What did we do with cigarettes, around cigarettes? I mean, it's a lot. You don't see as much of it. More people are trying to quit because we did kind of turn the culture around a little bit to look at cigarettes as, as what they are. They're an addictive drug, and it's probably not the healthiest thing to be doing. Some people are still going to do drugs. I still fall off the wagon and smoke nicotine, right? Or do nicotine. But we got.
Quitting is easy. You've done it a million times, right?
Yeah, it's. But we got to just think about addiction is like that, and I don't care if it's nicotine, heroin, or fentanyl. The only difference is nicotine kills you longer term. Fentanyl can kill you right away, and so can heroin. And so, it's a medical issue at root, and we need better programs to deal with addiction so that, people that do get caught up in this have a path at least to follow. But, I think we just got to accept, I don't recall a time in human history when drugs weren't part of a culture. And how they're dealt with is has varied from society to society. Even now, you have much more open, I think, smart approach in some of the European countries with this. We're not Europe, though. These are smaller countries. We're going to have something different. Those programs, I don't think, are going to just be transported over here and work. But the point is, I talked to somebody at a function I was at who was a CIA analyst for years in Latin America, and I asked her, and she said, yeah, she agreed. The drug war is a joke. They're not even trying to reduce the demand side. It's not even in the picture. It's all about supply reduction, and that's all funding these huge budgets for Homeland Security and FBI and DEA and all the rest of the three-letter agencies, plus our intelligence agencies. There's no incentive to end the way we approach it because everybody that's involved is making big money on it. So switching gears is going to be very difficult. And
Are you
it's
talking
not.
about drugs or big pharma?
I'm talking about illegal drugs. Big pharma
Yeah.
is itself a source of addiction that we just
Right.
kind of conveniently ignore. There is no pain pill out there now that you're not going to get addicted to. And they don't give them out like they used to, like candy, but somebody has an injury, they're going to need a pain pill. Some percentage of them are going to get addicted to that. That's just the way it is. And then what? So we are not only addicting people with illegal drugs, there's many people that are very addicted to pharmaceutical drugs under a doctor's care even. So this is the problem. It's a big one, but violence against cartels only begets more violence, and you aren't going to shoot your way out of this problem. But I don't think they even think that. I think they just see it as a way to manipulate, use it. Since we can't get rid of this problem, let's use it to our advantage. And that's where all this stuff comes in with the CIA and geopolitical politics and funding armies with drug money and funding insurgencies with drug money and funding, covert actions meant to destabilize governments through narco-traffickers, through criminals and drug money.
Right.
That's.
Right. Well, I mean, like I say, my daddy first told me about, he was branch chief head of East Asia Analysis Office for the CIA. Okay. And his first words to me, he says, "Well, the Vietnam War is about drugs. There's these secret societies behind it." I didn't understand it, but in looking at it, because again, he was basically talking about Skull and Bones, which was started by a drug smuggler. Okay, and we're talking in the 1830s. Okay, and once they lost after the Second Opium War, they lost their cash cow. Okay, they did machinations and geopolitical things to foment the Spanish-American War again, to start making it illegal again. Okay, because again, as soon as it's illegal, they have a cash cow, which then allows them to play games with us people from out in the shadows. Okay, and my research showed that the whole thing about marijuana being a gateway drug was something that they set up. Okay, because again, they were after the boomers. They wanted us to be, really addicted to heroin. Okay, and because I mean, it was very interesting being a kid in the 60s, and there'd be pot around. All of a sudden, the pot would be gone, and there'd be all kinds of white drugs. Okay, so there is a more than just oh, people trying to get rich. There has been some social things about this, and it was very interesting too, being a hippie and seeing drug importation networks being set up mostly for marijuana, and in talking to that, I was talking to one cartel member, and they told me that they had a a valley there in Mexico where they'd been growing poppies for over 100 years. Okay, and they said this company came to them and said they were shipping out of Brazil oil, and they had an oil pipeline, and they wanted it to come up in that valley and then go back down. Okay, because it's part of my posit because officially, they say that there's 1 million to 1,200,000 junkies here in the United States. I think there's a few more. Okay. But at 1 million to 1,200,000, it takes a ton a day. Okay. And now some people, they could buy a month's supply. Some people buy a week. Some people buy three. But most people are daily opium intake, and so they need, somebody to come to them every day, or they need to find that person to buy their daily opium intake. Okay. And so it's a huge amount that has to be, passed around every day. I mean, a ton a day, and that's only at 1 million to 1,200,000 junkies. Okay. So it is a huge business. And yes, and it's kept our banks alive. Okay, because I mean they even talked about it directly in the 2008 thing, that the only thing that was keeping the banks liquid was the drug money. Okay, and it seems to me that this money running through your banks, I mean, you tend to know where that's coming from. Okay, so they're giving people's passes on illegality because they want to keep
Yeah.
the liquidity.
Yeah. And another thing, and to your point, when Nixon and Ehrlichman said this in an interview later, he said the reason that they um, started the drug war, that Nixon started the drug wars, said, you couldn't make it illegal. It was during the Vietnam War. You couldn't make it illegal to be black or a hippie, basically, an anti-war protester. But you could use marijuana, the illegality of marijuana and heroin, and disrupt all their networks, their political networks, raid them on the pretense of the drug war. So it's always been used, yeah, to marginalize or to oppress or to attack political opponents. It's been a political cudgel in this country. Whether they're allowing the drugs in for that, you got to ask yourself, if they think it's only hippies and blacks that are getting addicted to this stuff, there's a mentality out there, and that's not true. But if that's their mentality, yeah, then that mentality would use their power to continue that. The thing about heroin, like the poppies in Afghanistan, which we allowed to be grown and didn't allow, and then we allowed, right? And the rationale they use is, well, all that heroin is getting sold to Iran, and our enemies, so we're getting them addicted, which is good. So we obviously use drugs as a tool of war too, to get a population addicted, to weaken their social their social cultural
System.
Yeah. And by the same token, this is not a zero-sum game. The CIA is not the only operator in town. I was told by another CIA case officer whose expertise was the Soviet Union, right, at the time. And he said that the KGB disappeared and did a trick on us. They basically, KGB now is the mafia. There is no way distinguishing the mafia from Russian intelligence anymore. They operate hand in glove. So they obviously see a benefit to addicting Americans too, right? And China the same way with fentanyl. So you have these, it's being used addiction is being used as a tool of war in many cases, agreed. And when you're at that level, you start making decisions that aren't in the best interest of the people in general, human rights. Or you're basically saying that we're going to kill them slowly and ruin their society slowly by making these drugs a major problem for them. And with drug addiction comes a rise in crime, a rise in social dysfunction, all the stuff that you see in our streets, people slumped over and, in lines from doing fentanyl, wasted lives. So there's a lot of people that I think in this world really, don't have empathy, that will use these kind of conditions and make them worse for some benefit they see for them, whether it's making money off it, whether it's, destabilizing a government, or weakening a government, or creating problems for a government you consider an adversary. All that's fair game. Funding armies you mentioned Southeast Asia and Vietnam. We're using sales from, because that's the Golden Triangle. There's opium's moving around there, and it's usually warlords that are in that drug trade, and they're using it to fund their empire, their mini empires, and their armies. And we got in on that game. We were facilitating the armies that we saw beneficial in Southeast Asia, and propping them up, by allowing and facilitating drug trading, heroin, which in turn maybe addicted some of the people we wanted to get addicted as well, on top of raising money for the armies to kill these people. So it's a nasty, nasty game.
Yeah, yeah. So, we just did a book too by a gentleman that's a big, one of the sources of your book, and we're getting a lot of pushback from the CIA and the mafia. I'm talking about Tosh Plumley
Yeah.
and Deep
Yeah.
Cover, Shallow Graves. What are your thoughts about Tosh?
Tosh is the real deal. But the thing is, when you first hear his stories, you think he's nuts, or you think, and if you do a cursory search on him, you'll find like negative information about Tosh here and there, and right. But the reason I know Tosh is real is, first of all, I met him doing a radio program in New York, right? And the radio program was by this guy named Mike Levine, who was deep undercover DEA for years. He's a legend in DEA for sure, but he knew the land. He knew all the players, and
Big White Lie.
Right, wrote Big White Lie. And Mike looked into him and said, Tosh is the real deal. And then I was able to get, congressional testimony. He's given testimony to Congress, more than once, but every time he does, they classify it, right? And that means if he tells his own story, technically they could go after him for revealing classified information, even though he's the source of all this information that they want to keep under wraps. So I know that happened. I have seen the testimony. Some of it leaked out, and I talked to the people that brought him in to testify. One of the chief of staff for Senator Gary Hart, and said that, yeah, he's the real deal. The only thing with Tosh is, like all of us, he's been around, he's been involved in all these ops. He's been an operator since he's in the Army. They recruited him. Basically, he joined as a teenager. He wasn't even legal age. And, someone saw something in him. He got recruited right in from right in the Vietnam era. So, but Tosh also has his opinions, just like we do. So he'll tell you what happened, but then he might add what he thinks that means, or whatever. And you just got to distinguish what his opinion is from what he actually did and what the facts were. But he's, I think, the thing about Tosh is, you won't believe what he's saying initially in many cases, because it's so, it's, how is this possible? Is this real? Right. But everything I've checked out, that I've used in my book, or when I was doing coverage, he's always right. And usually he's right ahead of the game. He's telling you things that are going to happen. And they do, because he's still got some deep contacts out there, and he still is operational himself to a degree. He was training drone pilots at some military bases. So, I mean, he's one of the people that, when he's gone, there'll be 2 obituaries written about him. The one in the New York Times that they don't write, that they just don't. This guy never existed. And then, the hidden history of the United States, where Tosh will be one of the major figures because of everything he revealed in his lifetime. And the book, I think, is a big help for that. I think, his stuff's so out there in different places, and particularly with the JFK stuff, which I don't follow, right? And I think Tosh has just made some claims about what he did. And from there, there's this whole realm of speculation that takes off. Like, what did it mean? He was on an abort team. I believe he was. I believe what he's saying actually happened. But what that means is a whole other can of worms, as you know. And
Amen.
and I think it just like supercharged all the JFK stuff because some of this stuff that's what I've discovered. It's like there's this giant game going on under this big shell, right? Like a and every once in a while you can poke a hole in the shell and look in and you'll see parts of it, right? And maybe you get another hole over here and you'll see another part of it. But it's just, and I'm not even certain one person understands all the game, right? Because it's so compartmentalized. And it's also layered on top of administrations. One administration favors maybe the Scheinbaum and the Medina party, right? Maybe the Democrats would be, because I think she is a democratic force. I don't think she personally is corrupted, personally. That's my opinion. But people around her are. But, so maybe we prop up Scheinbaum and try to make her administration weed out some of this stuff. But now we have a different administration that just wants to get rid of them all and they don't care who's corrupt or not in Mexico as long as they work with us.
Right.
So it's just a different attitude. So this game gets readjusted every time we have a new president, essentially. And can I say the word? Can I swear in here? In Mike Levine would agree. He called CIA a bunch of frat boys and barroom warriors that screw up everything they take on. He had no respect for them. He's, at all. He says people give him way too much credit. Most of what they do doesn't work or it blows back on us in horrible ways. And it's just, you shouldn't be like, oh, they have some magic insight in the world. Well, these are just a bunch of greedy dudes doing the bidding of what might be a good president or a greedy president. I shouldn't.
Right.
Everyone
Well,
at the CIA is that way, but their ops over the years have proven to be less than effective in many cases.
yeah, my dad
Reveal, right? Where were they?
Yeah, my dad turned down a life changing bribe, and he's one of the few that didn't take the money.
That's the problem. I
Yeah.
agree.
And now you're a real journalist. Okay. You aren't some crazy conspiracy theorist or anything like that, or just I mean, you've been a real journalist, and journalists don't last a lot around the CIA drugs and the narcotics story. I mean, and you're a friend of Gary Webb.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
I got to meet him too and talk with him several times, and he's not with us anymore. And just, I mean, he broke an amazing story. So what about journalists looking into this? How did that affect your career as a journalist?
Well, the truth of the matter is, all the investigative reporting I've done on the drug war, I've had to do through outside channels. Like I made my living covering business and finance, right? For mainstream papers, and no, they didn't want any part of this. In fact, I was told to stop doing it. I was doing some investigation that got me jammed up by the government, right? So that's the first thing: is the government will come after you. Like they've been after me twice for covering this stuff, and both times they came up empty. But newspapers and mainstream organizations don't like that kind of trouble with the government. They really don't. It costs them money. Investigative reporting is expensive, and they don't see the upside to it from their bottom line. So yeah, you have to do it on mostly funded by yourself or through other news organizations, platforms like Narco News that I wrote for that give you the platform to do this. There's no reward monetarily for it. It's going to cost you money probably. And so, the only reason I've done it, which is foolish maybe, is I still believe in a democracy, and I believe that this information, regardless of how I get it out there, is important to get out there. So there's a record of it, and maybe down the road it helps somebody else. I don't know how all these dots will connect, but enough of this information gets out there, it does affect the zeitgeist of the culture. The narrative matters, and if the narrative is we're the good guys with the white hats, always, we're taking on all the evil narco traffickers and the evil foreigners, then that's the narrative that's being pushed out there, and the mainstream media tends to just perpetuate the main narrative that's in the culture. It rarely runs against it. But there is another narrative, and the other narrative is this drug war is a lot more gray than you think, and it's a lot more screwed up than you think. And the only thing that really keeps it going is that everybody's making money on it, and the death and the mayhem and everything else around it is just a consequence of that drive to have power and money and control. In the case of where we're at now in society, there's a mad race for rare earth minerals to fund AI, to keep AI going because it's going to need it. There's a mad race for energy the same way, not just AI and our society in general, and that seems to trump any if we can get a lock on that, and it costs us 150,000 lives in Mexico, that's okay.
You got to be a government approved trafficker, right?
Yeah, well, it helps, and there have been government approved traffickers.
Yeah.
And up to this day, you just got to look at the Hernandez case. How can you justify that? They say, that just was some joke that, well, Biden, it was a political person. Give me a break. So it was, we continue to work with our narco traffickers. We continue to fund death and mayhem in other countries. And, other countries are doing the same to us. This drug war is way out of control. There are no white hats left in it. It's just a matter of, which side is winning and which side is losing. And the reality is it's been a stalemate for 50 years, 50 plus years. So it's
white hat lie. Yeah.
Yeah. And it isn't like some of these guys don't have the right intentions when they go in, but once you're in there, you see how corrupt it is. What do you do with it?
Amen.
You get marginalized as a law enforcer or CIA agent if you have to fight back or try to do the right thing. If you report these people, where's the oversight? The whistleblowers get destroyed.
Yeah.
That's what happened to Gary Webb.
Yeah.
He was destroyed by our mainstream media and by CIA media manipulation, anything they could use to destroy him. He's the best investigative reporter in a newspaper sense in the country, and he couldn't get a job, right? And that's what Bowden said, and it's in my book. He said, that tells me all I need to know about this business I'm in, mainstream media. You can collect a paycheck every 2 weeks as long as you don't draw blood. And Gary drew
as long
blood.
as you don't do your job.
Well, it's you can do your job and report the news. It's that extra step where you actually ask why. Why is this happening? And that's the one that gets you in trouble.
I remember John Dodson, if you remember him in the ATF back in Fast and Furious.
Yeah.
I mean he was an awesome whistleblower. He really blew the lid off of that scandal or helped to.
He did.
I don't know what happened to him, but my guess is he took a lot of heat. And I don't know. Do you know what happened to him?
He did. I haven't talked to him in a while. What happens to whistleblowers, the lucky ones, is they just outlast the news cycle and try to go quietly. There's a couple I know that, but they were always tied up in litigation. It was their careers were ruined. No more promotions, so they basically force you out. If you can keep your pension, you're lucky, and you do everything to do that if you get a good lawyer. But usually they try to just take everything. They get rid of your pension, everything. I'm convinced there's a whole psychological program that someone in the government developed on how to destroy whistleblowers, that are coming forward with things you don't want them to. I mean, things like they put them in like a closet for an office. They don't give them any work. They basically make it so miserable for them. And then they attack, all their benefits and their reputation that they force them out. And once they're out, then it makes them look like, they couldn't handle the job or whatever. Their effectiveness, whistleblowers diminished, their reputations are ruined. And, it's very difficult for them. And it's over and over again.
Well, okay, we need to think about our listeners here. Let's kind of wrap this up. I mean, Lord have mercy. It's enough here to keep you up at night,
But there's some good news. There are people, and I hope you agree, in all these agencies and in the country who do want things to work out, who do want things to be done right. Despite 55 years of this crap, we still have people that come up new generations of people. So there's hope. We just got to have the leadership in this country to actually empower the people on the ground that are doing the work to do the right thing instead of having the leadership that actually penalizes them and oppresses them for doing because they're not leaders. They're not. We don't have leadership. We just have cliques and cartels running our country otherwise.
Yeah.
They're not democratic leaders. We need leadership that is responsible to the people for a change. And every once in a while we get that. But when we do, we gotta make sure it works. And the people still got to hold their feet to the fire. We're all human. We're all susceptible to this greed, and power is the most addictive drug. And it really is. And we've all had these people that were great friends and then they get promoted and suddenly they don't know you and they treat you like crap. I mean, how could somebody who was your friend your whole life suddenly get like a position of power and then they decide you're a peon, I'm not going to deal with you, I'm cutting you out of my life. And it's the nature of power. And the Constitution tried to deal with it with checks and balances. Most of them we're eliminating right now. We don't have any, but that's the only hope is checks and balances. We're not going to create like a perfect world where everyone does the right thing all the time. That's just nonsense. But we can have checks and balances and we can have justice, real justice. And these are attainable goals. We used to believe in them. We started a country because of it. Let's get back to that. Let's go after the things that matter, the things that check hate, that check power, that check greed.
Amen. Amen. You have any last words, Todd?
No, just The Great Pretense. Y'all got to pick it up.
Okay.
It's a great read.
And Bill, where can people find your work?
Well, obviously they can get it through TrineDay, and Amazon has the book, and I've got a website that has more background and some of these interviews that called the Great Pretense.org, O-R-G.
Okay.
So basically the name of the book.org.
Well, thank you guys very much for your time and onwards to a better future for our children.